All right. I think we are there. And,
Just a second after the
okay.
recording voice.
Uh, welcome, everybody. I'm Tayyib Mahmood. I'm a board member of the SWIR, and it's a pleasure to be part of the third uh, South Asian Literature Festival. And obviously, this festival focuses on literature coming from South Asian communities, whether at home or in the diaspora. And we have authors and other panels. But what could be more important than figuring out how the voices of the writers get out to the public? Meaning, how does writings get published? What may be helpful, what may be not. So, we have a wonderful people with us to talk about that. This session is entitled "South Asian Stories and Publishing," and we are very fortunate to have with us Ayesha Pande and Anjali Singh, and this will be moderated by Laiba Fatima. So let me take a second to introduce our wonderful guests. Ayesha founded Ayesha Pande Literary in 2007. Before becoming an agent, she held several editorial positions, including as a senior editor at Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. She's also on the board of Art Omni and the AALA, that is the Association of American Literary Agents, where she founded the Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and helped launch the nonprofit Literary Agents for Change. Her clients roster includes Abraham X, Kendi, Patricia Engel, Danielle Evans, Matthew Celeste, and Lisa Coe. While her interests are wide ranging and eclectic, she works mostly with literary fiction, narrative nonfiction across a broad range of topics, including history and cultural commentary, memoir and biography, and the occasional work of young adult fiction. She is drawn to distinctive voices with a compelling point of view and memorable characters. Thank you, Aisha, for being with us. We have with us Anjali Singh. Anjali started her career in publishing in 1996 and has been a literary agent at Ayesha Pande Literary since 2015. As an agent, her authors include Bridget Davis, author of the acclaimed memoir The World According to Fanny Davis, My Mother's Life in the Detroit Numbers, Susan Abul Hawa, author of the 2021 Palestine Book Award winning Against the Loveless World, Nawaz Ahmed, whose debut novel Radiant Fugitives was recently published to great acclaim, as well as C.A. Davis, author of How to Be a Revolutionary, and Rachel Hall, author of The Other Mother, both novels forthcoming in 2022. She's on the lookout for character driven fiction or non fiction works that reflect an engagement with the world around us and the graphic novels for all ages. Thank you, Anjali. Thank you for being with us. And finally, let me introduce you our moderator for this session, Laiba Fatma. Laiba graduated from Vanderbilt University in 2021 with a major in English and a minor in mathematics. That's a good one. We have to talk about that another time, Laiba. How does one mix English and mathematics? She is originally from Lahore, Pakistan, and currently lives in Nashville, Tennessee. She spends her free time reading, writing, knitting, and playing ukulele. And I must add, solving mathematical problems. Thank you, Laiba. Thank you so much for not only being here but to facilitate this wonderful conversation, which I'm sure a lot of our friends and people out there are waiting to hear from our guests. So I give it over to you. Go get them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Taya, for the wonderful introductions. And of course, once again, a huge shout out to Aisha and Anjali for being here with us to discuss South Asian stories in publishing. Before we dive into some of our prepared points of discussion, I would like to let everyone watching know. Please feel free to submit any questions you have as we talk. I will try my best to incorporate them into our panel and make sure we answer as many of your queries as possible. At the end of this discussion, near the end of it, we'll also dedicate some time for Q&A separately. But again, if you have any questions before that, please don't hesitate to send them in at any given point. The theme of this panel, the purpose of this panel is twofold. We'll be discussing both the idea of race, specifically, being South Asian or being South Asian American in the publishing industry. And on a more general note, we will also be discussing tips to increase your chances as a writer of color to find representation, to secure a book deal, etc. Let's start off with some of the heavier questions about race and your personal experiences. Ayesha, Anjali, as agents of color who represent diverse voices, do you think there's a bias for what kind of South Asian representation sells? How would you describe said representation? Let's start off with Anjali.
I was really hoping you were going to give that one to Ayesha first.
You were muted. I was like, does that mean she's ready? I don't know.
Not ready to go. No, that's a really big, meaty question. And it is hard to make broad generalizations. I would say that how books get published comes down to who's there making the decision, right? About, do I want to invest in this book? Can I envision an audience for this book? And can I sell this book, right? Like when you're selling a book, it's primarily an editor has to fall in love with it. And it does come down very much. Like you're not trained to think in this sort of abstract way of, I know what the market research says and who I can sell to. You're trained to really only respond from an emotional place of, did I make a connection with this story? Do I have the passion to see it through? And can I envision an audience for that? So like, and then you have your publicity team and your marketing team and your sales team within the publishing house weighing in, making also decisions about, not only should we buy this book, but how do we value this book, right? How big should the advance be? And a lot of that also comes down to a lot of subjective decisions and thinking about who the audience might be. And so all the way down the chain, right? We're talking about an industry that's not diverse at all, including the booksellers, right? And the bookselling community. So I don't feel like I've answered it specifically, but I would say that because so much of the decision-making is made in this very subjective way by a kind of a publishing industry that isn't very diverse. Like the sales force really primarily is white men. Well, white men who live they don't all live in the New York area because they're spread across the country, right? But I think that I'm gonna throw it over to Ayesha now because I got us going.
Yes, you did a fabulous job getting us going, and yeah. So if you imagine the way that editors make decisions for acquisition, they as Anjali said, they are very much responding from a very personal place, and so. They will be bringing, their own experiences, their own points of view, their specific cultural touch points, to bear when they're making a decision. And so a book that is, say, entirely set in India, they don't really have, the cultural awareness or knowledge to bring to the table beyond, the few things that they may know about India, such as, the bride burning and the dowries and, the mud huts and, the cows on the street and things like that. And so they are going to want to then find, those sorts of familiar images or scenes within the book. And if it doesn't conform to, their expectations of what they imagine, India or any South Asian country to be like, it's hard for them to find another way to connect. Because, culturally, characters respond very, very differently. Just think about the the notion that a character always has to be active, they have to sort of have agency and make decisions on their, on their own behalf. Well, if you're familiar with, familial constructs in India, for example, Indian women, especially in rural areas, don't really have a lot of agency. So it actually wouldn't be true to, the entire culture to have a woman, who kind of makes all these decisions on her behalf. She follows what her parents tell her to do, and then she does what her husband tells her to do, and her mother-in-law tells her to do. So, but that sort of goes counter to sort of a Western woman's ideal of wanting a character, who kind of forges her own fate. And these are just some of the biases, that people bring to the table, and makes for a really, really hard time finding somebody who can actually connect with, the story in a very authentic way.
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing. Another thing, which is a big piece of what goes into the decision to publish a book, is who is the author and what are they bringing to the table. And so it's particularly difficult if you're an author who's not already based in the US with a certain kind of literary anointment, right? Have you been to the right residencies? Have you studied with the right people? Do you have mentorship? If you are a writer who's coming from another country, the editor and the publisher don't have a way of like framing you and understanding you, and you don't have what's considered a literary platform. So that makes it harder. And then another thing that I end up often explaining to Indian authors who seek me out is, remember, I'm working in the US marketplace. I might care about India. That market is important and it's politically important. But when it comes down to like the size of the advance, right, which is what we agents live off of because we live by commission, I need to be focusing on the US market because this is where I'm based. And then therefore, the US market is very much aimed towards a white readership, right? Like, we can now name it, but the implicit framing is this is for white readers. Even the Indian American population is way too small a slice percentage-wise for that to be carried as a potential audience in, the heads of publishers. So I just wanted to add that.
We actually just had a question come in from Anjali Mitra, and she wants to discuss this idea about, reframing the story and pitching it to an editor that you were just talking about. So Anjali asks, what do you recommend to someone who is receiving from agents comments like, I don't have the editorial vision for this, or I don't know how to position this, I guess, in front of an American audience, of a Western audience? Should one try to reframe the story? If yes, then how? Or should one just keep trying with others in the industry in the hopes of finding a match? And to kind of add on to Anjali's question, because I was actually thinking about the same thing, right? So, Ayesha, you talked about people already have a particular vision about what India would look like, South Asia would look like. And usually, and perhaps not even usually, but a lot of times people are looking to reaffirm those biases. And that's something that that's what makes a particular story that they might not be able to relate to completely, but they would be able to enjoy it because it reaffirms their biases in some ways. How can writers find a balance between being true to themselves and their stories and then tuning their work to a white audience or to an American audience? Should they have to do that? I mean, I think this is the same thing that Anjali is asking, but I do think this is an important question that I have as well.
I mean, should they have to, right? Like there's like the deep philosophical, like, yes, I hate that it's a colonial imperial legacy system where to get the big advances and to be taken seriously, you need a US and a UK anointment. You also want to reach a large readership because even in India, which has a huge population, that English language segment of publishing isn't actually reaching a huge population. It's reaching a few thousand people, right? So in order to want to be heard and to be read and to be taken seriously in this kind of international way, you do actually have to acknowledge, and I feel like thread the needle, right? It's like, I have to be realistic about who I think my audience is, and how I'm going to reach them. I mean, there have been books, like, I don't know if I would say The White Tiger was explicitly written for like Westerners. I don't know. This isn't a sort of a theory class, but it's also interesting to me that the person who bought that was a South Asian editor. And so there have occasionally been books that, like that really, really wonderful book, Gotcha. I'm totally butchering the name, right? But that was a book that was translated from Marathi, maybe, and then brought here. And it's like absolutely set within India, was not in any way written for a white audience, and yet it worked, right? That can happen. But some of that isn't just serendipity, it's kind of getting into the right hands of someone who's kind of well connected enough to make it happen for you.
Right. And I feel that both Anjali and I, represent authors, who are writing these kinds of stories. And we are coming up against this challenge and this wall with editors over and over and over again. And I know that, my strategy has been, to keep trying, that I hope that there's one editor out there who in some ways can connect with a story outside of their sort of narrow framework of their own experiences. And that mostly does happen. Unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily mean that now you're sort of, you're building a foundation that people will start to examine or think about these projects differently. You kind of have to build your case again over and over every time and hope that the book succeeds, and then with the next book you can grow that person's career. But it's pretty much that you understand right from the beginning that you have this hurdle to overcome, and you take that into consideration.
And then it also translates into when you get, it does really only take one editor, and that's a beautiful thing. But it also means that when you have one editor, you're not getting the buzz necessarily, you're not getting the big advance, right? And yeah, you make this very good point about you're not changing the structure fundamentally either.
But would you say that the industry is changing in some ways? I mean, I understand that it's still primarily, white, but would you agree that it is changing? And if yes, then what kind of ways do you think it's changing in? And now that it is changing, if you do agree with it, how can South Asian writers enter the industry at this interesting moment where it's kind of in the middle of not still being primarily white, but there's still some concept of diversity, still some concept of like some importance being given to diverse voices?
I would say that the industry is changing. I mean, there's definitely more people of color and people from different cultural backgrounds entering into the industry. They are still mostly in junior positions, except for some sort of more high-profile hires. So it remains to be seen whether they will make their way up the ladder and then actually have an impact, once they have decision-making power. Having now, sort of engaged with, the idea of DEI and truly anti-racist work, I don't necessarily think that individual hires make a difference. You have to really think about changing policies, and I'm not sure the level to which hiring practices or hiring policies have actually changed yet. So I'm kind of reserving judgment.
Yeah, that's a good answer. It really is. I think I don't want to discount the ways in which the industry is evolving. I do think the kids' book space is a little bit further along than the adult book space in terms of understanding and recognizing the need for diversity, and being a slightly more mission-driven piece of the business, because kids book publishing is in conversation with teachers and librarians, and books just have a longer window to get established, and they can win prizes kind of years out. Whereas the adult book world is very capitalist and very cutthroat. You have basically a 3-month window around pub, and then it's kind of on to the next one. And then like in the years that I have been in this industry, we've just seen a ton of conglomeratization, right? And that isn't good for the little guy necessarily. So yeah, the publishers are paying lip service to the idea of diversity. They are more consciously hiring a diverse sort of entry-level workforce. They've made some high-profile hires. of Black editors in particular, and that I think is meaningful. But it still feels tokenistic, and it still doesn't feel like that there's a true investment in or understanding of what inclusivity would look like and how that could be really transformative for this industry. Because, you know, like publishing, like many forms of cultural control, is very clubby and very elitist, and nobody really wants to give up the power. So
to kind of keep talking about this question, but get a little bit more personal, I mean, I understand that, you know, both of you do talk about that the industry has changed in some ways, but in your personal experiences, what were some difficulties that you experienced when you first came into it that you might not experience now as agents of color, or, you know, difficulties that you still do experience as agents of color?
I actually feel like I started in publishing in '96, and it was sort of just at the tail end of the multicultural moment. People like Junot Diaz had really taken off. So I think I was a little bit naive and sort of blinded to how kind of white the industry was. And then I feel like we went through all this conglomeratization, and in a way it got whiter. And as a junior person, I had friends of color in the industry, and then they fell away, right? Because it was hard to move up. And so then I think I found myself further along in my career actually feeling more isolated than I felt in the beginning. And also looking around me, I started as a scout, scouting American books for foreign publishers. So that job also kept me very connected. Like, I was outside of a corporate American structure, and I was connected to European and other international editors. So I think that was a little bit of a buffer from kind of how white, how corporate publishing is. And then when I went to work as an editor, I was incredibly lucky because I worked at the Knopf Group, and Sunny Mehta was still alive and he was in charge. So there was this kind of cachet, in fact, that my Indian heritage carried with it. And his assistant was Indian too, and she became one of my best friends. I feel like, oh my God, I had this little bubble. I didn't recognize how special it was. And that I could publish Persepolis in a place like that, where the value of that book, because of the culture of that company, there were things about it that were problematic, but I was actually in a place where I felt more seen than I did later, you know, and as I moved along in my career. That's, you know, like the whole glass ceiling piece. It's like, it actually got harder.
For me, the other part of it is that one doesn't necessarily recognize the ways in which one is not validated or marginalized or isolated. And it takes a while to understand the criteria that need to be in place in order to move on in the publishing world, you know, and that very much has to be about, you know, as Anjali was saying, well, she had her little bubble, but it didn't turn out to be something that accompanied her as she was moving through, you know, through her career and into other places. And that's the thing, you know, you have a tribe, and the tribe is based on similar experiences, you know, similar backgrounds, you know, similar communities in which you grew up and on which you can draw for common experiences. And for me, you know, it became something that became apparent to me as I moved up as an editor in publishing, and realized that, you know, my specific, you know, sort of cultural awareness or understanding was not, in fact, an asset. It was actually a liability, because what I was bringing to the table and the ways in which I was evaluating work was not mainstream enough, you know, and you needed to be able to understand what is mainstream and what can work, you know, in front of a mainstream audience. And as an agent, the thing that was different is that I could, you know, I could use my own barometer, you know, my own evaluation, and trust, you know, what I loved and what I believed in. But I also recognized that that there would be a price to pay. That, you know, as I was mentioning before, you know, that I would have to work much harder to build the careers of those clients, you know. And I could tell you some stories about, you know, some rather mainstream clients or very successful clients that I have, and how hard it was, you know, to actually get people to even consider them seriously, editors could consider them seriously.
Yeah, having been, I mean, I haven't worked full time in the publishing industry as yet, but just I have been exposed to the idea that a lot of times, it is about money. Oftentimes for companies, it is about money. It really isn't about diversity. Isn't really about. I mean, I understand Anjali's point about tokenism. I think that that's definitely something that I might not have personally felt, but something that I come to realize more and more, especially as again, somebody of color trying to join the industry myself. uh, Now that we are kind of at our half mark, I would like to shift gears a little bit and kind of talk more about just general questions about publishing, and I think Aisha's last comment was a good segue into that. um, to start off with some basic questions about getting into publishing, what do you think are some ways that writers, specifically, I guess South Asian writers, can present their work so that it grabs an agent's attention?
Well, can I just say one thing about the money? I feel like they reduce it to, and the mainstream is code for whiteness, but that's, I think, what Aisha and I are both trying to say, is that they're leaving so much money on the table by having this very narrow idea of what can sell, and not valuing that, like, you're bringing something else. So they say it's about money, but actually it is about cultural fit and belonging. But anyway, in terms of how do you get an agent's attention, right, for your work? I think one thing I always tell writers is to be so intentional in who you talk to about your work. And part of that, being able to be intentional, is knowing how to talk about your work, what you're trying to do, who you're trying to reach, and which other authors you sit alongside. And the more clear-sighted you can be about that, and that is part of the journey of writing the book, you might be working your way towards that, but at the end of that process is when you craft a query letter to an agent. And all of those things, the more clearly you can put it forward, the more clearly it communicates to me that this author is ready for an agent. They know how to talk about their work. They know how to help me think about the work as a professional. And it makes me, and then they often, for me, I like to feel very intentionally approached too, right? Like, I know that you've published this person and this person. This is how my book is in conversation with these, or this is why this book resonated with me, and I hope this book will resonate with you. If it's like, dear Anjali Singh, I've written, a thriller about, like machine gun, like terrorist attack, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, why would you think that would be, like, you have to then frame it as something that might be of interest to me. And I feel like the more intentional you can be, the better chance you have of actually finding the match, right? But that does require doing a lot of legwork before you even write the letter and decide who you're going to approach.
Yeah, and that sort of segues into the larger prep that you should do. I absolutely don't believe that you should write to a white audience, but once you are ready, you have to have a real strong understanding of where this book would fit, and how what audience there might be for that book, and to really do some thinking about what would be good comparisons with your book, ideally ones that have been published within the last 5 years and that have relatively recognizable names that have been published here in this country. Taking yourself seriously means sort of educating yourself about how publishing works. So even beyond, intentionally approaching, your agent, sort of really thinking about how, as Anjali said, how can I talk about this book in a way that helps Anjali, contextualize it, and give her all of the sort of information that she needs, the tools that she needs in order to be able to then pitch it to the appropriate editor. And, it's not an easy thing to be able to talk about your writing. It's more than just, kind of summarizing the plot. It's really, really important that you expand upon, the themes and the ideas, the thinking, what's distinctive and new and fresh about it, and also what it draws upon, what literary traditions it draws upon.
I think I usually say two things. One, people often spend way too much time telling me what the story is about. I don't need to know the whole story. I don't want to know the whole story. Go look at some flap copy. It's not going to tell you the whole story. The whole point of that letter is to sell me on why I would want to spend time with this book. So you just have to tell me enough to pique my curiosity. And that often means establishing either stakes of some kind, if it's a work of fiction, but I also, just to tag off of what Ayesha said, it's really helpful to have you tell me in a line or so why you wrote this book, why it was important to you. If you can articulate that, usually it can help me understand why it's worth my time, right? Like imagine that we are reading dozens and dozens and dozens of these letters. So the more important it feels to you, the more I'm able to see why this might also be something important because there is so much out there, right? So it has to both be in conversation or sit alongside books that are recognizable to me, but also be adding and saying something new and different, and something that we sort of, what makes this book essential right now? Because that's the very beginning stage of selling it, right? You're selling it to me, and then I'm going to have to go sell it to an editor, and then I take it up a notch, and then they sell it in-house, right? And then you're going to have to ultimately persuade someone to spend $25 and 10 hours of their time on you. So you have to make a good case, right? Why should I make the time for this?
So we've had more questions come in, and one of them requires us to backtrack a little bit, but we will come back to this conversation. So one of the questions from Alka kind of goes back to when Anjali, you were talking about how editors are, and people in positions of authority at publishing houses are leaving money on the table because of their narrow definition of what can sell, and not accepting South Asian stories as something that fits into their definition of what can sell. So I guess the question that Alka wants to ask now is that, how is the market for the South Asian diaspora stories? Have things changed a lot since Jhumpa Layu's breakthrough work? Like we don't have to get into numbers, but I guess to speak a little more concretely about the market, how would you describe it?
I don't think there is a South Asian market per se, right? It's just an individual book. I do think there was this moment, right after The God of Small Things and Kiran Desai, there was a moment when like South Asian literature was a little bit having a vogue. I don't feel that there's a vogue. I mean, what we come up against, Ayesha and I were selling an author, a Bangladeshi author, and the editor really liked it, but they already had a book with a Bangladeshi character in it, so they couldn't take it, right? So it's still this idea, and the books aren't going to be sold like to South Asian readers or book clubs particularly. So I mean, as you know, it's almost impossible to make a broad generalization about South Asia to begin with. So it doesn't exist as a market. Everything just comes down to book by book. There was recently a South Asian book that sold for like $1 million. I mean, it sold for a ton of money, and it sold for film, and that isn't yet in the marketplace. But I feel like since Vikram Chandra, maybe that's kind of been the biggest kind of buzzy South Asian book. I mean, Ayesha, you can correct me if you have something else in mind, but I feel like that's one where it'll be interesting to see what happens. But yeah, I don't feel like there's a particular interest in South Asian content. So, and Jhumpa, of course, was Indian American, and she was writing very much about an American Indian experience. So that's also kind of pretty uniquely different from a book basically completely set in India. But obviously Megha's book was set in India, and that got a ton of buzz and a ton of attention and was very successful. There was another book Grove published recently by a young Indian writer about a young woman's journey from Kerala to Kashmir that's set entirely in India. So it's not that South Asian books don't sell, it's very hard to make a broad generalization. And it is, to come back to what Ayesha said, very much about finding an editor who has a vision and wants to take it on.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add to that. I think Anjali, really put her finger on it. I do think that book that you talked about, that big buzzy book, is one that has, I could see why it sold for so much money, because it's basically about a criminal family, so it's kind of like a thriller, but it's set in, I think, Mumbai or something like that, but it's like these criminal families are the same everywhere, so I think people could really very clearly see how that book could translate and also into film and things.
I think we're also now coming up with the sort of what's the distinction between literary and commercial, right? And I think that author very deliberately set out to write a page turner, and maybe even started out writing it as a TV series, or like it came to the world fully formed as a book that was supposed to like grab you. And as part of the conglomeratization and what's happening in the market and Amazon's dominance, right? We're in a space where some books get all the resources, all the advances, and all of the support, and then it's harder and harder for the kind of smaller ones. And so I feel like that was a very clear case of a book that was anointed as being a big book and a page-turning book, and then, it's going to get a lot of attention. But it is, I mean, I do feel like there was this moment, we had like Vikram Seth and Salman Rushdie and like all of these kind of literary writers all sort of writing in a particular moment, sort of in that late 80s, early 90s. And I don't feel like we're in a moment like that. We have good individual books coming out, but I don't feel like we have kind of sort of these literary eminences who are South Asian, who are kind of appearing.
Or a trend, where you feel like people are actually, editors would sit up and pay attention if the book is by a South Asian writer, Right now, the trend is, Black voices.
I was Nigerian for a while.
yeah, exactly.
Finally Black American, I think.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I think you guys cut off for me for a little bit there. So if you've already answered this, I'm sorry about asking that again, but do you think this idea of it, South Asian stories not necessarily being a trend, do you think that only applies to South Asian stories or to all stories by writers of color?
No, I think that there have been trends over the years, in the years that we've been in publishing, where all of a sudden, Latinx is, really hot. And then, there was a while where Latin American was really hot, or South American. And, then there were sort of everybody from all the different African countries, were getting very special kind of attention. And so right now it's African American voices, but, so we're definitely in a trend-driven industry. I mean, there was also like the Dracula trend or the vampire trend, and then after a while we were told, oh, now there's vampire fatigue. So, that trend had jumped the shark, and, vampire books did not work anymore. So we know that the trend exists, and I think both Anjali and I have long ago decided that, we kind of ignore those trends because, we're just sort of doing our work and working within our space regardless.
Yeah, it's kind of sad we have to take turns, all of, communities of color. Like now it's my turn to be, to get a TV show, to get movies now. But okay, yeah, we have another question come in, and this one kind of takes us back to our discussion of, generally about publishing. So Pramila asks, I am primarily a poet trying to get my first novel published. Agents don't respond to my query letter with the sample chapters. Is it typical for agents not to respond if they're not interested? Since the formula for publishing a novel is by getting agents interested in it before it can even be sold to a publisher, it seems so much more difficult than publishing poetry, where we don't necessarily need agents. Do you have any advice for writers who are experienced in other genres but are new to publishing a novel?
I would say in that specific case, there might be a problem with the query letter, right? Like there's a reason people are not responding. And that it might be worth revisiting the query letter. And I don't really know what the novel is about, so it's hard to say. But I mean, poetry doesn't, there are no agents involved because obviously poetry books don't sell for a lot of money. But but also it's not a huge, as much like asking someone to read your novel is a really big commitment. And I think that's one thing I just like to say when I'm, in front of authors, because I think there's so much silence behind the desk. Asking someone to read a novel is a huge commitment, and we agents work on spec. So if I give my time to reading your novel, then it's because I'm hopeful that I can sell it. But often, in order to sell that book, I'm going to read it 3 or 4 times. We're going to do a lot of editorial work together to try and sell the book, because, and I think this is true particularly for authors of color, especially if you're in a literary space and not something that has an easy, clear commercial hook. The book has to be almost perfect in order to get the editor to bite, because for all kinds of reasons, right? Like the cleaner the book is, the easier it is for them to show their enthusiasm. Their work is editing, yes, but it's mostly being the champion in-house for the book, getting the blurbs, like sort of being that point person. So the less work that we give them, the more likely it is that they're going to see what the book is and buy it in that, the first time they see it. So anyway, just to remember that this is a business. We aren't evaluating whether or not your book is worthy or beautiful. We're evaluating, is this a book I can sell? Is this a book I care enough about to spend 2 to 3 years on it and maybe make $750 in the first 4 years of my work with this client? Because when you do the math on a $10,000 advance, that is basically what we agents are taking home. So we really have to care, and we have to really believe that this is the stepping stone in what we hope will be a long career, and that maybe the book will win awards, and then maybe we'll get a better advance for you for the next time. And but we aren't the arbiters of necessarily quality. We are the interpreters of the market. And then we're also just making very personal decisions all the time about what is on my plate, what can I give time to. And my list has turned out to be very heavily graphic novel focused, because I can edit those books quickly and sell them on proposal. And the novels that I take on, I love, but I know very realistically they're not going to pay the rent. So each and every one of those is really a commitment that is a mission-driven commitment from the heart. And so that's something to think about too. If you're not hearing from agents, that we come from a very, I can do what I want, but I also have to think about the money, because what I give my time to is what's going to pay my rent at the end of the day. But there are also small presses. It may be that your book isn't ready for an agent and kind of that sort of commercial machine yet, right? There are also small presses that do honestly consider submissions directly from authors. And especially if you're a poet, and maybe that's where you begin to build your literary platform. And then you look for an agent once that first book came out from the University of Ohio Press and it won a nice award. And then you have something that kind of can crack open the door with the agent on the next project.
Yeah, well said. And I mean, I do feel that there was a little bit of a tone of, oh my gosh, now I have to go get through another gatekeeper to even get to the editor. And, the sort of this notion of the agent as an additional gatekeeper, which, I mean, on the one hand, yes, that is true, because most big publishers won't even accept unagented submissions. But on the other side of that, it is, we will collaborate with you, and we will hold your hand, and we will, as Anjali said, spend a huge amount of hours, on spec, unpaid, bringing all of our faith and passion to this particular project, before putting it out there in the world. And I can tell you that both of us have spent years, getting a novel ready for submission, and then maybe only to sell it to a small indie publisher. And that's because we believe in this author over the long term. We know that maybe the first novel isn't going to sell big, but maybe the second one will, or the third one will, and we will hold your hand and accompany you throughout your career. So it is, a really, really, really big commitment for us to take on any kind of client. And it just really has to make sense for us, not only in terms of our own personal passion, but also because we see those long-term promises unfolding.
So I know that Anjali, you already mentioned that you take on works that of course when the query letter is convincing for you, and to you that a good convincing query letter is when the writer shows you how much their work means to them, and then that comes through to you, and that's how you kind of judge. But Ayesha, what does a good query letter look like to you? And of course, this is also a time to discuss very generally about any other tips that Anjali you also might have for writing a good query letter.
Ultimately, I will always look at the sample material, because I know that, your ability to write a good query letter is not going to determine whether you are a brilliant author. So I will always look at the sample material. But I do think that the query letter, as we mentioned in the beginning, is really, really crucial for you to start thinking about how to position your book, how to position it and contextualize it and compare it and provide, the tools for other people to help other people think about the book. So, a very brief first paragraph that, summarizes in 1 or 2 sentences what the book is about, and then, tells us about sort of the broader themes or premises of the book, and, and what, books it's informed by, what books it's in conversation with. And as Anjali said, why do you feel I would be a good agent for it? It's not so much because I need my ego stroked, but it is that, I feel that you have done your research, that you have done your homework, that you have carefully curated and selected a list of authors, or agents to whom you're writing, and I'm not just one, of hundreds that you're sending sort of an email blast out to. And then I have to say I do look at your bio, because I strongly believe that that writing is a craft, and that there are certain markers, of accomplishment and success that will show me indications that you have actually diligently practiced your craft. And that includes, have you had any short stories published? Have you received any fellowships? Have you won any awards or even been finalists for any awards? It's not even so much that, you need to have done an MFA program, which I know is a huge commitment and frequently, is out of reach for a lot of people, but that you have, worked at getting your work validated and recognized by a community, whose opinions, are meaningful.
And for people, I mean, since we're now kind of getting close to the end of this, for people who are having a hard time finding an agent, finding representation, would you be somebody who would advise them to go for self-publishing then? What are your thoughts about self-publishing in general, and what advice would you give for or against self-publishing?
I think it's not where I would start. I think self-publishing is the right thing for someone who is a natural marketer, maybe has a big platform already and is already kind of experienced at the work of selling, because yeah, it's really easy to self-publish something. That's not the problem, right? You can just put it up on Amazon. What's really hard is to get it attention and find a readership, and isn't that sort of the point of publishing? My advice usually is to really think about what a long road, that it is a long road, accept that it's a long road, and that you can constantly improve and make your work better, and that you're going to learn something even from the books that the books that quote unquote fail or don't get published and go into a drawer. But I often tell people if they're really hitting a wall that it might really be worth finding a freelance editor who used to be on the publishing side, who understands kind of what is required to get published, and they can help you either edit the manuscript, edit the proposal, work on how you talk about the book and how you pitch the book, and on that letter, because yeah, it is a different skill set, and being able to write a good book doesn't mean that you've written a good letter. But most novels, every book can always be better. And I feel like the demands on a novel, especially with how busy everyone is, are to deliver something that will hook us in the first 20 pages, right? And I find that most first-time writers really struggle with that, right? But the book starts on page 50. So maybe doing some of that work ahead of even getting to the stage of finding an agent, no matter what, I consider it, and it is usually a pretty insignificant investment, but like I consider it like a one-on-one crash course in learning how to write a book, right? Or go to Swanee or Breadloaf or someplace that allows you to get readers, build a community. Most people who've gone to MFAs, one of the main values of that, besides having a mentor who might, blurb your book or recommend an agent, is finding your readers, finding those 2 or 3 people who you are in conversation with, and you can say, read my manuscript, and what do you think? And kind of help you get it to the place where it might be ready for somebody else's eyes and the market.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that self-publishing is very effective for certain kinds of genres, and so if it's not if like the literary prestige is not important to you, that you don't care about that review in the New York Times or the long list for the National Book Award or the Penn Hemingway or whatever. And also if you're writing, in sci-fi or horror or romance or some of those, those kinds of genres, that people, tend to gravitate to, just like for entertainment. And, even though, of course, there's some that are extremely well written too, then I think, and as Anjali said, if you are a natural born marketer, and are willing to make that investment of marketing your own work, religiously and diligently, then self-publishing might be for you. But otherwise, it is, going back to the drawing board.
I would like to ask, I mean, is it true that sometimes even after you've self-published, your book does get picked up by, a traditional publishing house? And that in those cases, would you say that, I mean, of course you would, like you guys said, have to be a born marketer, and then your self-published book would have to do well to get picked up. But is that something that happens often, or is that something that's very, very rare?
I think, as Ayesha said, it's a genre thing, right? Like if you are writing a certain kind of genre-driven book and you can demonstrate that you've sold several 100,000 copies, right? Then maybe. But otherwise, publishing is kind of a snobby industry too. Like otherwise, it doesn't in any way help you to have self-published a thing. It just feels like, oh, it was out there and then nobody paid attention.
Right. And also that the bar is higher. It used to be, she sold 10 or 15,000 self-published copies. That's great. But now that books are available for 99 cents. It doesn't mean the same thing, honestly. And people are going to look at like what was the price point of the books, of the copies that you sold. So if you sold 100,000 copies at 99 cents, that's not necessarily going to be super impressive.
That's fair. That's understandable. All right. With that, we are at the end of our time. And as much as I'd like to keep talking more about South Asian stories in publishing, alas, all things must come to an end. First of all, thank you so much to everyone watching and everyone who sent in questions. We hope that this was helpful and informative and that we were able to answer most, if not all of your questions that you might have had about the industry before this. And of course, a huge thank you to you guys, Ayesha and Anjali, for not only joining us today, but also just, your work in amplifying diverse voices in general. I mean, I've worked with Ayesha Pande Literary before, and the reason why I wanted to apply in the very first place as an intern was because I knew that it was such an inclusive space. So thank you so much for coming out for this.
Thank you, Laiba. This was really fun.
Yeah, thank you, Laiba. You did a brilliant job moderating. It was great to see you.
Before we go, we do have one parting question from Vega, who just wants to ask, what were the 2 platforms you mentioned, Anjali, where we can join a community to learn about publishing? Oh,
I mentioned Swanee and Breadloaf, which are both based in the US. So one's in Tennessee and one's in Vermont, and they're both kind of writing camps. And you apply, you pay, you get selected to come, and then there's like a scholarship for certain people, but there's also you can pay to go, but then you're in writing workshops. And you also begin to form community, and agents and editors come, so you sort of can ask questions in person and start to build up your information. But there are online places too. Those aren't the only two, but they are two of the ones that we agents get invited to pretty regularly. But there's some on the West Coast too.
Okay. I'm sorry, Aisha, were you gonna say something?
No.
You're gonna Tin House. Tin House is another one. That's one on the West Coast.
Okay. So, and one more question that came in last minute. Does it make it easier for agents to pitch a book of authors who have a following on online platforms such as blogs, podcasts, etc.?
Well, I think that a platform can be helpful in our space, which is, sort of the literary fiction space. The platform consists of, the work that you have done, the work that you have been able to publish, the residencies that you have attended, the conferences that you've been accepted to, the prizes that you've been awarded. That is the best platform of all. Blogs and social media, I think, is more relevant, for other genres, particularly nonfiction.
Okay. All right. So that was the last question. Before we go, we just want to let everybody know that the festival is going on till October 24th. So do go on to thesphere.org to find out other events we're having. In 30 minutes from now, we are having another talk called From the Author's Lens, Getting Published, which will be a conversation with successful authors such as Alka Joshi, Shiba Karim, Sara Desai, and Nawaz Ahmed as they talk about their experience getting published in the US. Nawaz Ahmed, of course, is represented by Ayesha Pande Literary, so make sure to check that talk out as well.
So is Shiba, by the way.
So is Shiba, of course. Shiba Karim was actually my professor at Vanderbilt. I feel like I must have mentioned that at some point, but she was my one of my professors for a fiction writing workshop. Yeah, but yeah, so I mean, I can say for sure that she's amazing. So do make sure to check it out. And again, thank you so much, Aisha. Thank you so much, Anjali. Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye bye. Yeah, you too.